It is a Star Wars show, and I'm your host, John Justice. I'm glad you're with another episode. As always, you can email me, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, or drop a comment if you're watching the show on YouTube. I just wrapped up watching all of the most recent television spots and clips for the upcoming Skeleton Crew live-action Disney Plus Star Wars streaming show. And listen, I'm excited for what this could potentially be. I'm excited for its potential. I like the idea of what they're going for in terms of the vibe of this being something akin to a Goonies, an Amblin type adventure. I was, a little trepidatious in the beginning, seeing some of the footage in the earlier trailer, and specifically how sort of on the nose they were being in terms of suburban life and going to school. But again, this is something that we haven't seen in the Star Wars galaxy, and just because we haven't seen it before doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. We've essentially had what is akin to ghost towns, Western ghost towns in The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett, and Tatooine in and of itself sort of lends itself to that. So just because we haven't seen it before doesn't mean it doesn't exist in a galaxy far, far away, and it can't be relatable. The clips have me the most excited, watching the TV spots and seeing some of the interaction of the children and Jude Law's character. A lot of questions swirling around whether or not he's a Jedi. I don't think that he is, and if so, he seems to be of a different vein based off of some of the interviews that I've watched. If you have an opportunity, I would encourage you to go to YouTube, and there is about a 14-minute interview with the showrunner and directors of most and writers of most of the episodes for the Skeleton Crew. Really interesting insight into what to expect. I haven't heard anything relating to leaks yet. It doesn't seem like anybody has received any screener copies. I would think sometime probably in the next week, since this is debuting on December 3rd, we will probably hear some, spoilers, but at least some first reactions into Skeleton Crew, and I will certainly be sharing that with you on next week's episode. So let's get into some of the news this week.
We have a spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
So this news dropped last week, right after I had put up last week's episode. But according to The Wrap and several news outlets, Disney has pulled the untitled 2026 Star Wars movie from the release calendar. The company announced last Friday. The film is being replaced by Ice Age 6, which will now release on December 18th of 2026. Although unconfirmed, Sharmeen Obaid-Chinoy was supposed to direct a film rebuilding the New Jedi Order 15 years after the events of The Rise of Skywalker, which has Daisy Ridley attached to reprise her role as Rey. And the speculation was that that is indeed what that film was going to be. Now, we also know that Stephen Knight, the director of Peaky Blinders, the showrunner for Peaky Blinders on Netflix, and the writer for that Daisy Ridley-led movie that takes place post episode 9, left the film about a month ago, which is, I believe, the second or third writer that's left that film so far. As I've mentioned on this show many times, I don't believe that Sharmeen Obaid-Chinoy is going to be the director of that Daisy Ridley-led Star Wars film. Now, we also had news that we talked about last week of producer and director Simon Kinberg, most notably as it relates to Star Wars, a writer on some of the best Rebels episodes, has signed on with Lucasfilm to pen what is being told will be a trilogy of films, possibly starring Rey. And on last week's episode, I laid out all the different rumors relating to that. So I want to address that issue and perhaps what is happening moving forward and what I want to see happen personally with a Daisy Ridley-led series of Star Wars movies coming up. Right up front, I think that the Simon Kinberg news is directly related to what we heard in the cancellation of the Rey film for 2026. I'm fairly certain that one thing has everything to do with another. I think that Simon Kinberg came in, probably pitched Disney, Kathleen Kennedy with his version of a series of films that could be made. They liked it. They liked the pitch. They've signed on to it, and now he's off and running, writing those films. So at the moment, the only thing in the pipeline is The Mandalorian and Grogu coming out in May of 2026. Let me go to this article that I found from Cinema Blend. Really interesting piece talking about Rey from an interesting perspective, and I want to share with you my thoughts on it as well before I get into what I personally would like to see if I were pitching, Lucasfilm and Kathleen Kennedy on what the next series of films should be, starring Daisy Ridley. But first, let's get to this piece from Cinema Blend.
This is not going to go the way you think.
I rewatched the Star Wars sequels and now think we were way too hard on Daisy Ridley's Rey. The Star Wars universe is vast in a galaxy far, far away, but you want to know what people love to hate, Rey, for some ungodly reason. And I'm kind of tired of it because people are way too hard on her, especially after I just rewatched the Star Wars sequels for the first time in a while. Let me preface by saying this, that I do not claim to be someone who grew up loving Star Wars. When I was 5, my older brother and father were going to the Star Wars premiere, and I was at home playing with my American Girl dolls. I was not interested in this world until very late, probably when I began high school in 2012. However, as someone who has been a part of the fandom now for 12 years, I have some connection to this world, and I'm allowed to have an opinion, and it's that everyone is way too hard on both Rey and Daisy Ridley. I really have to talk about it because it's driving me crazy. And you know what? Let me say that I've seen a lot of negativity based off the comments that came out in the article that I shared. I think it was last week's episode or the week before that, where there was some sources inside Lucasfilm saying that they felt that Rey was the only viable character that they have right now. And I agree with that. I'm not saying that she's the best character that Star Wars had, but when you're looking forward in the storytelling right now, you're not going to be able to go back and tap in to those previous characters, especially from the original trilogy. And I still believe that the general public, the majority of people, think that Rey is a fantastic character, even though I've seen an abundance of videos that have popped up since that article that disagree with me. It's all subjective either way. The first 3 Star Wars films have a rock-solid story, but the prequels came along and they earned a fair amount of criticism. Now, years later, people are looking at the Star Wars prequels with an air of respect, and Hayden Christensen is getting the flowers he deserves. I genuinely don't think the same thing is going to happen to Rey because the sequel's flaws diminish her story in general. There are so many moments in these movies where I genuinely scratch my head at what happened because it doesn't make sense, and then Rey is right in the middle of it, somehow going along with what is happening. Now, I agree with some points that this writer has to say. That one there I don't necessarily agree with, but let me move on in her piece. I think the first of the sequels, The Force Awakens, sets up a really good premise. We had this nobody girl who didn't have a family, didn't have a name, and didn't really care for anyone, who was trying to survive on Jakku. The Force called her into this crazy galactic war. It's basically the recipe for success. Heck, Luke basically started as a nobody as well. It was only later that he discovered his true origin. But as the film goes on, the plot gets messier and messier, and it falls apart, they write, taking Rey along with it. I stand by that fact. A core trio always surrounds every good movie or TV series that is substantial in the fandom. Harry Potter, the new Spider-Man films. And she goes on and on with other examples. And Rey didn't have that. She didn't have that support system. I get where she's driving at. Ron and Hermione, the Spider-Man films, Ned and MJ. I understand that, but at the same time, I think that The Rise of Skywalker gets, a lot of unnecessary and unfair criticism because that was an adventure where they got the crew back together. One of my favorite moments in that film is how they all went on their adventure at the start of that movie, where you had Chewie, you had Rey, you had Finn and Poe all in the Millennium Falcon, with C-3PO heading off to Pisana, and they remain together for the most part until Rey separates from them. When you go back to, when they mention the original trilogy, they're all split up for the most part, just like they were, in The Empire Strikes Back, just like they were in The Last Jedi. So let me get back to some more of her points. She says that Rey didn't have that support system. Okay. Sure, there was Finn and Poe, but both of them feel so disconnected from Rey. Both of them feel like they were going on their own adventures, when most of the time, in any of these scenarios, the trio was constantly helping each other out. And again, I think if you were to go back and try to look at the original trilogy through that lens, that particular narrative falls apart, in my opinion. At the beginning of the sequel trilogy, Rey was pretty much a carbon copy of Luke. She did not have the same background, but she was the person who had nothing to do with the fight happening and was brought into it thanks to external circumstances beyond her control. The Force Awakens, which is my favorite, relied too much on the original films. I sometimes think that's fine if it's not broken. Don't fix it, right? But Star Wars fans of all ages wanted something different, something new. A new twist of some kind. You're never going to get a better plot twist than finding out Darth Vader is his father, but you can try. The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker attempted to do their stories, trying something new and testing out the lore, but it just fell flat, and the fans hated that more. Rey didn't have the same solid storyline that protected Luke during her 3 movies because things kept changing so constantly. It's no wonder people found her hard to follow. So she goes on for a little bit longer and, lays out further criticisms, which I don't want to sort of waste the podcast time on because I like the sequel trilogy despite its flaws. And inevitably she ends up saying what I have said, and that is that Rey is the most popular character to come out of those films. And she just believes that she was in a series of Star Wars films that kind of did her wrong, even though her character was solid. And that's kind of where I wanted to land with this. Again, I disagree with that. There is a disjointed nature to that sequel trilogy in what J.J. Abrams set up, what Rian Johnson did in making a Rian Johnson Star Wars film, which I quite enjoy, and then what J.J. Abrams did in bringing the whole thing home in The Rise of Skywalker. It's an interesting... Well, let me say, for me, it's an enjoyable watch to actually watch The Force Awakens and then immediately go into The Rise of Skywalker, even though I love The Last Jedi, just because those films, both of those J.J. Abrams films, complement each other so well. And of course, J.J. had a Herculean task in having to wrap up that trilogy that, had its controversies, along with wrapping up the entire series. And I believe that he did a more than admirable he put forward more than an admirable effort and did more than an admirable job in doing that. I quite love The Rise of Skywalker for what it is and feel it's a fantastic Star Wars popcorn film. But this brings me to what I personally would love to see Disney and Lucasfilm do. And this is something that I've said many times on the show before. I feel like they should stick to what they know, trilogies, and they should stick with the Roman numerals or just with the saga story and continue. You see, the thing about the sequel trilogy is that, you had this brilliant setup that George Lucas did. The genius of starting off his franchise with it being episode 4. Where you already have a galaxy in turmoil, the Empire is already established and taken over, and now you have this hero's journey in Luke Skywalker who goes on to save the galaxy, but also to find that connection and belonging that he's looking for. You go back to the prequel trilogy, and here you see how the Empire came to power, and how a little boy and a young man could end up becoming bad and the most evil person in the galaxy. When you get to the sequel trilogy, you kind of have a bit of a mashup of both. And you have a Kylo Ren that's kind of working in reverse of what Darth Vader was. And that was by design, and J.J. Abrams said as much. What I would do is I'd get back to the core of Star Wars. Keep it simple, stupid. Let's not overcomplicate things. And I actually think they did a good job in not overcomplicating things compared to a majority of the Marvel films that are out there that just get so incredibly convoluted, it's hard to follow anything. I get genuinely excited when I'm able to watch a film and it just keeps it simple while still being a big blockbuster. But I would do episodes 10, 11, and 12. And what I would do is, with Rey at the core, and I don't want to get into specifics of what her story is going to be, except for the fact that she is and would be center to saving the galaxy once again, and perhaps building characters, not perhaps, building characters around her that can carry that mantle in the future. I think about history and what we're looking at right now in our own current history that we're living in, whether it's politics or what we're seeing play out on the world stage with the conflicts overseas that have gone on for generations, for crying out loud. There's no reason that the galaxy can't be threatened once again. There's no reason that there can't be an individual or a faction of people that are still influenced by what came before in the dark side and the Empire. With the sequel trilogy, you kind of started off with this idea of the First Order building in power and starting to take over, but never fully seeing that fleshed out. Flash forward some 15 years, and let's create a galaxy that is threatened by a galactic rule, an individual who is inspired by what came before. There's no reason to say you can't do something similar to what they tried to do with Kylo Ren, but just put a different spin on it. Make it a different person. Make it a female villain. Perhaps we come in the middle of an individual who's raising his or training his own group of Sith-type characters, ignoring the rule of two, for example. But take us back to this galaxy and echo the prequels. Let's take the first movie, let's draw from history, and let's start to watch a rise in power, culminating in that first film with a victory for the heroes, but an evil that's out there and threatening the galaxy once again. Going back to the genius of what George Lucas did with the original trilogy, let's take an opposite approach to what Rian Johnson did in picking up The Last Jedi directly after The Force Awakens, which really kind of stifled the storytelling. And after we get past episode 10, when we get to episode 11, let's have a 3, 4 year, 5 year time jump. And let's do kind of what Lucas did in having this middle act where everything falls apart, but we join this middle act, and whatever this new evil faction is, they have taken over portions of the galaxy, akin to the Empire. Give us that rise in power, that time jump. And then when we get to the finale, now you can again do perhaps another time jump, which brings us to something more akin to what we saw in the Jedi, another final conflict. Again, I know I'm talking about, sort of a rehash of what we've seen before, but with solid writers and really good storytelling and drawing on history in the way that George Lucas drew from those Saturday morning serials that he loved so much, I think there's a potential in there to really bring back the magic of what Star Wars was. Don't completely redo what came before it. Don't do what The Force Awakens did in kind of a mashup of all 3 original trilogy films in one movie. Give us new locales. Give us new spaceships that don't necessarily align with what we're used to seeing from the original trilogy and the sequel trilogy. Give us sort of an updated look that still fits within the Star Wars universe. You have this resource of all of these amazing artists, and I go through all of these art books for Star Wars that offer up just, I could go through the art books and say, choose that design, make it look wholly fresh and new, but rooted in what we know and what we've come before, that power of the dark side and the light side, your freedom and liberty versus your tyranny and oppression. Now I'm kind of drawing off of what I wrote in my books in my original trilogy, and perhaps I'm biased in that way because that's kind of what I tried to do in my books. I hope that's what they do moving forward. I think that could really bring back the old fans by giving you just enough fresh and new while still having it lean into the conflicts that we've become so familiar with, while at the same time bringing in new fans who can discover Star Wars once again without doing a rehash of what we did before, a complete redo, but at least drawing on the power of the narrative and the storytelling that George Lucas created that gave us this franchise that we all love so much.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
And we get to your listener feedback this week. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, or you can leave a comment up on YouTube. First, we hear from Greg Pratt, who writes, "What a joke! Rey is a terrible character. A Kathleen Kennedy self-insert. Any film in this direction will bomb. Disney killed Star Wars. Let it die." Okay, Greg. Thank you for writing. Princess Cupcakes writes this. "As someone who is a fan of the sequel trilogy, I feel this is a terrible idea going back to last week's episode. There is still so much animosity over how the original characters were treated and a lot of decisions that were made. Killing off all the Skywalkers and then slapping the Skywalker name on Rey was one of the most vapid cinematic decisions ever made. Younger kids aren't watching Star Wars." That's not true. Sorry, Princess Cupcakes. I love your comments, but there are a lot of kids that are growing up, especially young ones that are growing up on the new, Young Jedi adventures. There's a new audience that's out there. The Star Wars merchandise doesn't sell. Actually, it does sell. They still keep creating merchandise. Maybe like it was when we were younger, but it is doing okay. A lot of older fans have checked out. I don't care how much money the sequel trilogy made. Anything revolving around that character will not bring in that kind of revenue again. Okay. Well, thank you for the comment, Princess Cupcakes. I do appreciate it. And here's the thing. Everybody is pretty much disagreeing with me on last week's take, and I believe they're probably going to disagree with me on this week's take too, but I look forward to hearing what your thoughts are either way. N Black 1948 writes this. "Lucasfilm will never learn. We don't want any more Rey. The character sucks blank, all right? Hater channels like Nerdrotic and Geeks and Gamers are licking their chops. They will all have an absolute field day. This will be the final nail in the coffin. They are so creatively spent. They have no good ideas. It's so obvious." Listen, I appreciate your comment, but I feel like that's a really unfair thing to say. We don't know what the stories are. So you can't go and say that they're creatively bankrupt just because they're bringing back a character who's young enough to return in films that did make over $1 billion. And yeah, that does matter. People did go see those films. And there is an audience out there clamoring for Star Wars, and an audience out there that liked Rey enough to go see The Rise of Skywalker despite all the criticism of The Last Jedi and gave that film $1 billion. At the end of the day, we will see who was right and who was wrong. Hey, that wraps up the show this week. Thank you so much for checking out another episode. Be sure to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Follow the podcast wherever you go. And if you enjoy reading or listening to science fiction, check out my science fiction space opera series, EMBARK, a fast-paced, action-packed sci-fi adventure. Treat yourself or a friend or a family member. Written for adults, but it is completely age-appropriate for ages 11 plus. You can follow pilots Taft, Katha, and their crew on a journey of survival across the galaxy as they fight for humanity's future. 7 books in all in the series. 3-book trilogies in books 1 through 3 and 5, 6, and 7, with a spin-off story in book 4, Corbijn and the Asteroid of Misfortune, which you can dive right into. As a matter of fact, all 7 books are written so that you can dive right back into the action just in the same way that George Lucas kicked off episode 4, or you can start at the beginning and move all the way through. If you like your science fiction to be epic with some romance, some really cool technology filled with action, and leaning into the Star Wars type adventures, EMBARK is perfect for you. Head on over to Amazon.com and search for EMBARK and John J.O.N. Justice to pick up your preferred copies today. Thank you so much for checking out another episode. I hope wherever you are, you're happy, you're healthy, and you're safe. God bless, and I'll talk to you next week after Thanksgiving. So I hope you have a great one. I'll talk to you then. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My nerd world.